Step back into the golden courts of the early Islamic Caliphates, where power stretched from Spain to Persia, and behind the veils of politics lay secrets of the bedroom that history often leaves untold. These were empires of wealth and influence, yet also of hidden desires, strict laws, and practices that blurred the line between faith, power, and intimacy. Concubines, eunuchs, and rulers bound by both passion and control shaped a world where sexuality was not just private, it was political. Some customs shocked even contemporary observers, revealing a tension between public morality and private indulgence. This is the side of the Caliphates rarely written in the textbooks: the whispered stories, the forbidden rituals, and the shocking realities that defined life behind palace walls. Drop the time you're watching this in the comments. I love seeing when my history travelers arrive. And if uncovering hidden truths excites you, subscribing is always your choice. But the revelations only get more intense from here. The first shock that greets you isn't the echo of hooves on stone streets or the deep call to prayer across domes. It's the vision of a boy painted like a bride. His eyes are darkened with kohl, his lips tinted with berries, and silk sways against polished marble as he walks with an exaggerated grace. You don't need to squint to realize this was no ordinary servant. He is on display, and his performance, half masculine, half feminine, was meant to blur lines so carefully drawn in public law, yet crossed so casually behind palace doors. In the caliph's court, where every move was wrapped in ceremony, these performers stood out as a paradox. They were men, yet groomed to echo the beauty of women. Entertainers, yet capable of reshaping how power itself looked when presented. At feasts, while generals recounted conquests and scholars debated scripture, the arrival of dancers with rouged cheeks and braided hair could silence the entire room. No one admitted openly what everyone understood. Attraction in that world was wider than the official rules. You can almost feel the tension, like watching a play where half the audience pretends to frown while secretly leaning forward in fascination. This wasn't rare. From Baghdad to Cordoba, records speak of beardless youths praised in poetry, painted, and perfumed to captivate rulers and guests alike. The Abbasid caliphs, in particular, became associated with such spectacles. Al-Amin, ruling in the early 9th century, was notorious for his fondness for them. Chroniclers mocked his preferences in biting satire, yet in the same breath, they praised his court as a jewel of culture. The contradiction is striking. One man remembered both as patron of literature and as a ruler whose personal entertainments made him infamous. The poets amplified the scene. Abu Nuwas, the most celebrated of them all, filled verses with playful admiration of wine and beautiful boys. His poetry was daring, witty, and impossible to ignore. Imagine hearing lines recited aloud in a gathering where the audience laughed, winced, and applauded all at once. His art worked like satire does today. It toyed with taboos, poked fun at solemnity, and slipped forbidden truths into the rhythm of rhyme. That's why his legacy endures, not just as literature, but as testimony to the hidden corners of his society. Of course, this world was far from uniform. The Caliphates stretched across lands as diverse as Spain, North Africa, and Persia. In some courts, such performers were prized, admired like rare treasures. In others, they were condemned, sometimes punished harshly. Picture the same act being applauded in one city, but outlawed in another. It's the same contradiction you see when an artist today sells out concerts in one country, but is banned from another stage. Culture, it seems, has always depended on the lens through which it's judged. Wealthy patrons played their part too. Competition brewed not only in warfare or trade, but also in the splendor of entertainment. Having a troupe of the most dazzling performers, some dressed in elaborate silks, others painted in subtle cosmetics, became a marker of status. Guests whispered about who had the finest gazelle-like boy or the most talented dancer, just as modern elites might compare luxury cars or rare art. Prestige was measured not only in land or coin, but in how shockingly one could bend norms behind closed doors. The eunuchs added another twist. They, stripped of their own sexuality, managed these performers. It was they who arranged appearances, guarded chambers, and controlled access. The irony is heavy. Men prevented from desire became the gatekeepers of the court's most delicate indulgences. A eunuch could deny entry to a favored dancer or permit a scandalous meeting, wielding invisible power in spaces where kings pretended to reign supreme. In truth, these silent figures often choreographed the very intimacy that defined court life. Yet the question lingers: what did this mean for the larger society? Religious scholars condemned it in sermons, invoking strict punishments and fiery warnings. But poetry, music, and eyewitness accounts proved the practice thrived anyway. Society was living a double life. Publicly, rules were preached. Privately, rulers and elites bent those rules to fit their appetites. Isn't it remarkable how often history reveals the distance between the laws written in ink and the lives lived in whispers? The imagery of these gender-bending courtiers unsettled many because it challenged definitions of masculinity and femininity. A boy painted like a bride was not only entertainment, he was a walking question mark.
Doesn't look like we're moving
He forced everyone present to ask what it really meant to be man or woman, sacred or profane, acceptable or scandalous. Those questions didn't fade. They survived in the verses, in the satire, in the quiet embarrassment of chroniclers who wanted to condemn but couldn't quite look away. When you step back and imagine the scene, the palace isn't just filled with drums and lutes. It's humming with tension, desire, hypocrisy, and curiosity. That boy, painted like a bride, isn't a side character in history. He is a symbol of its complexity, standing between law and longing, reminding you that even the most powerful empires were never as rigid as their rules claimed to be. You leave behind the dancers with their painted eyes and step deeper into the palatial maze, where the air smells of incense mixed with perfume. Behind heavy doors, you find yourself in the hush of the harem, the private world that outsiders speculated about but rarely saw. It is here, beyond the public audience halls, that another set of rules unfolds. These rules are not written in law books, but stitched into curtains, whispered in corridors, and enforced by silence. The harem is not merely a place of women, as one might imagine from novels or exaggerated films. It is an institution, a fortress of velvet and surveillance. Women of every background lived here. Noble brides from foreign dynasties, concubines from slave markets, and servants who kept the routines running. Each role came with a careful set of codes: how to walk, when to speak, what gifts to accept, and what gestures to avoid. One misstep, and your entire standing could collapse like a tower of glass. Can you imagine living in a world where even the way you lowered your eyes could determine why? Contrary to popular image, not every harem was a den of constant indulgence. In many palaces, it was as much about politics as pleasure. A caliph's wife could hold influence in diplomacy, and the mother of the heir often wielded enormous power. Behind silk curtains, alliances were negotiated, rivalries sharpened, and destinies plotted. What you see is less a story of passive beauty and more of survival and maneuvering. Think less fairy tale, more political chess match, played with jewels and silence. The rules extended even to dress. Every piece of fabric was symbolic. Certain colors reserved for favorites, certain jewels forbidden and less gifted by the ruler. The layering of meaning in clothing made the harem a theater where fashion spoke louder than words. A robe too bright or a veil too sheer could send whispers flying about ambition or disobedience. Even food carried codes. To be sent a plate of delicacies could signal favor. To receive plain bread could hint at decline. Have you noticed how in your own life, small signals, a late reply, a missing invitation, carry a weight far heavier than they seem? The eunuchs, ever present, ensured these codes were obeyed. They checked doors, arranged schedules, and monitored conversations. Their loyalty was essential, yet their power subtle. Imagine the unease. Women of high birth relying on men stripped of family and legacy to determine who entered their chambers or received their letters. Trust was less a choice than a necessity. Historical accounts suggest that the strictness of these hidden rules created both beauty and tension. In one court, a woman who broke etiquette by laughing too loudly at a banquet was quietly moved to less favorable quarters. In another, a concubine who mastered the art of discretion rose to become the favored companion of the caliph, shaping decisions that rippled through the empire. The difference between disgrace and influence often came down to whether one could navigate the invisible map of harem etiquette. The architecture itself reinforced these dynamics. Corridors twisted to control movement, walls muffled sound. Courtyards served as controlled spaces, where glances could be exchanged but little else. If the public mosques and audience halls were designed to project power outward, the harem was designed to fold power inward, tightening it like a fist. Step by step, you realize the space itself was a silent enforcer, shaping how people moved, lived, and schemed. And yet, within these walls, human emotions still pulsed. Friendships formed, rivalries burned, and small rebellions sparked. A story is told of a young servant who sneaked poetry into a concubine's chamber, verses written not by a famous bard, but by a guard smitten with her. Such small acts remind you that even in the strictest systems, people look for cracks to let humanity through. Do you think you would risk punishment for the chance to be remembered in a single poem? The harem's rules were not all shadows and whispers. They also offered protection. For many women brought in as captives, the harem provided safety from harsher fates outside. Within its walls, they could receive education, learn music, even rise in status if fortune favored them. It was a paradox. The same walls that imprisoned also shielded. The same rules that controlled also offered stability. History rarely deals in absolutes, does it? As you linger in this world of veils and codes, you realize the harem was not a single story, but 1,000 interwoven. To some, it was a gilded cage. To others, it was a ladder to influence. To most, it was both at once, depending on which curtain you stood behind. You push further, past chambers perfumed with rosewater, until the noise of the city leaks through again, this time from the slave markets. If the harem was the inner sanctum of power, the market was its noisy doorway. Here, in crowded squares, beauty itself was placed on a scale beside coins. Merchants shouted, buyers haggled, and bodies, yes, actual human beings, were presented like luxury goods. The practice was so normalized that travelers often described it with the same tone they used for spice bazaars. The demand was enormous. Rulers and nobles sought slaves not only for labor, but also for companionship, music, and intimacy. Circassian women with pale skin and light eyes fetched some of the highest prices, while Persians and Turks were prized for their refinement. Ethiopian women, often admired for strength and grace, also became sought after. Each origin carried a stereotype, carefully marketed by traders to inflate value. Doesn't it strike you how disturbingly similar this is to the way advertising today plays on stereotypes to sell products? The currency has changed, but the psychology hasn't. Auctions could be theatrical. A girl might be dressed in embroidered silk, her hair styled, her nails tinted, while a slave dealer recited a list of her virtues: singing voice, elegance of movement, or even supposed fertility. Buyers circled, inspecting with a detachment that still unsettles anyone reading the records. It's one thing to hear about trade in silk or spices. It's another to imagine human beings promoted with the same sales pitch. And yet, the paradox deepens. For some, this purchase meant a strange form of social mobility. Women taken from distant villages sometimes rose to astonishing power within harems. Shajar al-Dur, who began as a slave concubine, later became the ruler of Egypt in the 13th century. Think about that leap. From being sold in a market to wearing a crown. That doesn't erase the cruelty of the system, but it shows how unpredictable its outcomes could be. Men, too, were traded for beauty as much as skill. Young boys from Central Asia were brought to serve as pages, musicians, or attendants, many carefully trained to entertain and please. Some were destined for the courtly spectacles you saw earlier, painted and perfumed. The market supplied not just bodies, but carefully curated roles, feeding an appetite that laws publicly denied yet privately demanded. Isn't it revealing how societies often write rules in ink, but shop with coin for their exceptions? The markets weren't hidden in back alleys. They were central.
Trust me.
In Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, they stood alongside the largest commercial districts. Chroniclers wrote about them in the same breath as textile stalls or spice vendors. The casualness is what jars you most. Imagine strolling down a bustling medieval street, passing one booth selling saffron, the next displaying ivory, and the next presenting living people. Traders developed reputations. Some specialized in singers, others in dancers, others in what they claimed were women of extraordinary refinement. Buyers trusted or distrusted merchants the way modern shoppers check reviews. The economics of intimacy turned people into brands, and successful dealers guarded their networks jealously. Not all markets were equal. In some regions, regulations tried to curb abuse, at least on paper. Buyers were supposed to guarantee fair treatment, and Islamic law, in principle, encouraged kindness to slaves. But like so many rules in history, the distance between theory and practice was wide. Records of punishment for mistreatment exist, yet far more evidence shows cruelty being overlooked if the abuser was powerful enough. You can almost hear the shrug of history. Ideals announced in sermons, but power deciding the outcome. For the people being traded, The experience must have been surreal. Imagine being a girl from the Caucasus Mountains, speaking no Arabic, suddenly thrust into the roar of Cairo's markets. She might not even understand the cries of bidders or the gestures of merchants. Her fate could swing from drudgery in a minor household to luxury beside a ruler, depending on who lifted a hand at the auction. A single nod could redraw the entire map of her life. The market also acted as a cultural blender. Captives brought new music, recipes, and fashions into the empire. A Persian lullaby sung in Cordoba, a Circassian braid style worn in Damascus. Fragments of distant homelands slipped into daily life, carried on the voices and habits of those traded. Out of cruelty came unexpected exchanges that shaped cuisine, art, and even language. Isn't it striking how empires expand not only through armies, but also through the people they absorb, willingly or not? As you step back from the din of the market, the contrast is impossible to miss. Outwardly, the empire proclaimed justice, piety, and moral order. But here, in plain sight, it transformed human beings into commodities, placing price tags on voices, faces, and bodies. The crowd disperses, coins jingle, and the reality lingers. The palace's hidden world depended on this noisy trade. The haggling voices of the marketplace fade, replaced by a quieter but no less strange paradox: the eunuchs. The first sight is unsettling. Men dressed in fine robes, their posture erect, their gaze sharp, yet marked forever by absence. They were not warriors, not scholars, not nobles, yet they held the keys to chambers where even generals and viziers could not step. Their bodies had been altered, but their power was immense. And here comes the hook. How could men denied the very pleasures of the harem become its most feared gatekeepers? Eunuchs guarded harems and courts across the Caliphates with vigilance bordering on obsession. They stood at doors, controlled entries, and knew who met whom, when, and for how long. Think of them as living security systems, except with human memory sharper than any lock. Their loyalty wasn't a matter of choice. It was engineered. Their separation from ordinary family life, binding them completely to the palace. Can you imagine having your entire identity stripped down until your only purpose was to serve? The paradox ran deeper. In stripping eunuchs of conventional masculinity, rulers had created officials who seemed neutral, but were anything but powerless. Their inability to father children meant no dynasties of their own, which reassured rulers. Yet precisely because of that, they were trusted with secrets no one else could be told. A whispered plan for succession, a discreet arrangement for the night, everything passed through eunuch hands. Doesn't it strike you how often history gives power to those no one expects? Some eunuchs rose to astonishing influence. Al-Mansur's reign in the Abbasid period is filled with accounts of eunuchs managing correspondence, finances, and even diplomacy. They weren't just guards. They became advisors, masters of protocol, and in some cases, kingmakers. A caliph might appear in grand robes to the public, but behind the curtain, it was the eunuchs who decided which visitor was granted audience and which letter was burned. Daily life with them was steeped in ritual. To approach the harem, you had to pass their inspection. To send a gift, you needed their approval. Even music and poetry recitals required their permission. The eunuchs created a bottleneck that made them indispensable. And like all gatekeepers in history, their position invited bribes, alliances, and whispered bargains. Modern lobbyists might not wear silk turbans, but the principle feels eerily familiar. Access to power always has its brokers. The image of the eunuch wasn't uniform. In some chronicles, they appear as loyal servants, the very embodiment of discipline. In others, they are painted as cunning schemers, manipulating both women and rulers for their own advantage. The truth, as usual, likely lies somewhere in between. After all, when you spend a lifetime observing the most private desires of the powerful, wouldn't you learn how to turn that knowledge into leverage? Their presence also influenced culture. Eunuchs were often patrons of music, responsible for organizing performances in the harem. They supervised the training of dancers, the introduction of new instruments, and even the commissioning of poetry. Without them, many of the spectacles described in earlier sections might never have reached the heights they did. That is the hidden irony. Men stripped of personal indulgence became curators of indulgence for others. Some accounts describe the loneliness of eunuchs too. Cut off from ordinary family life, they formed close bonds with one another, almost like a brotherhood forged in shared absence. A few became renowned for their wisdom, writing letters and treatises on loyalty and service. Others were remembered only for cruelty, using their position to bully or punish those lower in rank. The spectrum of humanity remained, even in such an altered form. A famous example comes from the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, where eunuchs managed enormous estates and oversaw the construction of mosques and palaces. Their authority extended beyond bedrooms into the very architecture of the city. To call them servants would be laughable. They were administrators who helped shape the empire's face. Have you noticed how history often hides the names of those who actually kept the gears turning? The eunuchs remind you that power doesn't always belong to the obvious. They had no armies, no heirs, no thrones. Yet through discipline, secrecy, and sheer proximity to rulers, they carved out a sphere of influence that left its mark on centuries of governance. Watching them walk silently through marble corridors, keys at their belts, you realize they are both prisoners and masters at once. And that contradiction is what makes them unforgettable. The palace doors swing again, and this time you find yourself in a chamber thick with fragrance. Rosewater drips from bronze basins. Oud smoke curls in the air, and silken curtains ripple with candlelight. Tonight is a night of selection. The Caliph, or sometimes a favored prince, prepares to choose companionship, and the entire palace seems to hold its breath. The ritual is elaborate. Women are bathed, their hair braided with threads of gold, their bodies dusted with fine powders that shimmer faintly under lamplight. Musicians play softly in corners, lutes and drums keeping a rhythm meant to soothe nerves and heighten anticipation. Eunuchs direct the procession, ensuring each candidate enters with precisely the right posture. It is less a meeting of people and more a performance staged to perfection. Imagine walking into a job interview where every detail, from the tilt of your head to the scent of your robe, has been rehearsed. One mistake, and your prospects vanish. The selection process wasn't simply about attraction. It carried weight for politics, family, and even foreign diplomacy. A concubine from a noble family could reinforce alliances, while one from a certain region could symbolize conquest. Desire was intertwined with strategy. To be chosen meant access to influence, sometimes even the chance to shape decisions whispered in pillow talk. To be overlooked could mean years spent in quiet corners of the harem, fading into obscurity. Poets likened the night of selection to a hunt. Candidates were described as gazelles, their glances as arrows, their steps as the play of moonlight on water. The metaphors reveal how charged the atmosphere was. Even chroniclers, who tried to maintain a tone of formality, could not resist lapsing into verses that hint at fascination. And the Caliph himself? He often remained hidden behind a screen, watching quietly before making his choice with a mere gesture. Historical anecdotes describe unusual outcomes. One story tells of a woman who deliberately broke the rhythm, refusing to follow instructions. Her defiance caught the Caliph's attention, and she was chosen not for her beauty, but for her boldness. In another case, a singer's voice moved the ruler so deeply that he bypassed dozens of more traditionally prepared candidates. The night was as unpredictable as it was staged, reminding you that even within strict systems, individuality could pierce through. The pressure was immense. Imagine the silent rivalry. Smiles stretched a little too wide, perfumes competing, every gesture calculated. Behind the calm performance, jealousy and fear brewed. Some women befriended each other to survive the long stretches of waiting. But on nights like this, friendship evaporated in the heat of competition. Isn't it uncanny how the same dynamic plays out in modern talent shows or casting auditions, where camaraderie collapses once the spotlight narrows? The Caliph's choice echoed far beyond the chamber. A favored companion might receive gifts of estates, jewels, or entire retinues of servants. Her family back home, if still alive, could suddenly find themselves showered with wealth. Her children, if she bore any, could one day stand in line for succession. That single moment of selection was not simply intimate, it was dynastic. History itself shifted in such rooms. Even the unchosen played roles. Some became attendants, musicians, or confidants, their talents redirecting them into other niches of court life. The system ensured that nearly every person had a function, even if not at the center. It was less about exclusion than about hierarchy. And hierarchy, once established, was enforced with precision. To you, the night of selection may seem excessive, almost theatrical, but to those inside it, everything was deadly serious. Lives, fortunes, and futures tilted on a glance, a smile, a note of music. The Caliph might appear calm, sipping sherbet as he surveyed, but every gesture of his hand carried the weight of empires. When the final choice was made, the chamber shifted. Perfumes faded, music quieted, and the chosen was led deeper into private rooms, her footsteps echoing softly on marble. For everyone else, the curtain fell, leaving anticipation for the next time the ritual would be repeated. You step back from the scene with a lingering sense of unease. Behind silk and candlelight, power and desire had just woven another thread into history's tapestry. The candles of selection burn out, and the corridors fall quiet. But you are not done wandering yet. In another wing of the palace, voices murmur over contracts rather than music. Here desire is not staged with perfumes and dances. It is inked on paper, wrapped in law. The concept is temporary marriage, and it blurs the line between what is forbidden and what is permitted. The practice took different forms. Muta, more common among Shia communities, could last from a single night to several months. Nikah Mishyar, emerging later, allowed couples to forego certain obligations of traditional marriage, such as shared housing or financial support. Both gave legal cover to relationships that might otherwise be branded as scandal. Imagine a loophole written so carefully into the system that passion could borrow the robes of piety, if only for a while. Not everyone agreed with these practices. Scholars debated fiercely, some defending them as pragmatic, others condemning them as thin disguises for indulgence. You can almost picture heated gatherings of jurists, one slamming his palm on parchment to insist it was lawful, another shaking his head to call it hypocrisy. The debates lasted centuries, echoing in texts that survive today. Isn't it fascinating how law and morality often wrestle, each trying to claim the upper hand? For the people involved, these contracts were practical solutions. A traveling merchant might take a temporary wife for companionship without the burdens of permanent union. A soldier, far from home, might do the same. Women, too, sometimes agreed because the arrangement gave them financial security or social protection. What looked like indulgence from afar could, up close, be survival dressed in ceremony. Records tell of contracts specifying details as precise as the duration, the dowry, even the number of visits. It was bureaucracy meeting intimacy, a fusion almost comical if it weren't so serious. Imagine filling out paperwork for something as fleeting as an evening, with witnesses solemnly nodding approval. Bureaucracy, it seems, has always had a knack for creeping into corners of life where spontaneity once ruled. The tension between public morality and private need shines here. Outwardly, rulers upheld sermons condemning lust outside of marriage. Inwardly, they tolerated or even encouraged these contracts because they provided a socially acceptable outlet. It is the same paradox you've seen in every corner of palace life. Rules announced loudly, exceptions practiced quietly. The system also carried risks. Temporary marriages could leave women vulnerable, dismissed without support when the contract ended. Critics called it exploitation wrapped in ritual. Others pointed out that, at least in some cases, women gained a degree of agency. They could negotiate terms, even set conditions for treatment. The balance of power shifted with each arrangement, as fragile as the paper it was written on. Poetry, once again, did not stay silent. Writers used metaphor to hint at these contracts, comparing them to fleeting moons or passing caravans. One verse likened Muta to renting a garden for a single season, beautiful while it lasted, barren once abandoned. The imagery makes clear how society wrestled with the impermanence built into the practice. Even among rulers, temporary marriages played roles. Caliphs occasionally used them to form quick alliances or to legitimize relationships without scandal. The records often disguise the details, but hints remain. Sudden unions, abrupt dissolutions, and the quiet shuffling of women in and out of palatial quarters. Power wrapped itself in ritual, and ritual cloaked what might otherwise be condemned. You cannot help but think of modern contracts, where fine print decides fates as surely as love or loyalty. A housing lease, a prenuptial agreement, even a subscription service. Each reduces human connection to lines of text and signatures. The palace's temporary marriages were not so different, binding people with ink while leaving hearts to fend for themselves. As the parchment is rolled up and sealed, the air grows heavy. The contract may satisfy law, but it cannot erase the unease of its impermanence. For some, it is a path to comfort. For others, it is a reminder that even sacred institutions can be bent to serve desire. You step away, realizing that here in the palace, Intimacy has as many faces as power itself, some glittering, some grim, all woven into the same story. The sound of scribes folding contracts fades, and now what rises in its place are voices carrying rhyme and rhythm. Poets stand in courtyards or lean casually against carved columns, their words drifting like incense smoke, intoxicating and sometimes scandalous. Here comes your hook. While scholars thundered against forbidden pleasures, poets laughed, rhymed, and turned those same pleasures into immortal verse. No figure embodies this more than Abu Nuwas, the Abbasid poet whose wit could make crowds roar with laughter and rulers squirm in embarrassment. His verses dance shamelessly between odes to wine and to beautiful youths, mocking taboos with a mischievous grin. Imagine him in today's world, a headline act at a comedy festival, raising eyebrows with every punchline, yet impossible to cancel because his genius kept audiences begging for more.
Goodbye, everyone.
His poetry
We'll see you
survived
soon.
not because it was
Write to
polite,
us.
but because it was sharp, funny, and unafraid. Abu Nuwas was not alone. Poets across the Caliphates crafted verses that hinted, teased, or outright declared affections that polite society refused to acknowledge. Some composed in metaphor, cloaking desire in images of gazelles, moons, or gardens. Others, bolder, wrote with bluntness that makes even modern readers blush. Gatherings where such poetry was recited became spaces of liberation, where laughter replaced sermons, and where rulers themselves sometimes encouraged the daring. Isn't it remarkable how power so often claims to police morality, but quietly funds its defiance? The poetry carried more than entertainment. It became cultural currency. A well-timed verse could flatter a ruler, win favor, or secure patronage. In a world where a misplaced word might cost you your head, a cleverly placed metaphor could instead earn you a purse of gold. Poets walked a razor's edge, turning risky truths into entertainment. Their skill lay not only in what they said, but in how they disguised it, like slipping a joke into a song so catchy no one dared forbid it. There is an anecdote of a gathering in Baghdad where verses about wine and boys were recited openly, the crowd laughing while a scholar nearby fumed. The poet ended his recital with a playful bow, and the caliph clapped louder than anyone else. The scholar dared not speak further, drowned out by applause. You can almost see the smirk on the poet's face. Words had won against rules once again. In Cordoba, too, poets found ways to push boundaries. Andalusian verse blended the sensual with the philosophical, suggesting that pleasure itself could be a path to understanding beauty and even God. The logic scandalized jurists, but enchanted audiences. Words, after all, travel more easily than laws. A decree might be forgotten, but a well-crafted poem clings to memory like perfume on cloth. The influence of these poets rippled into daily life.
The ancient texts.
Songs in taverns borrowed their verses,
Must be careful.
jokes on streets echoed their wit, and even in conservative households, lines from their poems slipped into conversation. Poetry blurred lines, just as dancers and contracts had, but with a permanence that performance could not achieve. To this day, Abu Nuwas's name endures, long after the rulers he entertained have faded into footnotes. And here's the irony. Some of the same rulers who punished others for breaking moral codes preserved and celebrated these poets. It was as if they wanted to taste rebellion without owning it themselves. Poets became the scapegoats and the stars, mocked by clerics, yet adored by audiences. Their verses reveal a society both stricter and looser than it claimed, a culture of contradictions sung out loud. Think about how, even now, music lyrics test boundaries. Songs climb charts by hinting at what parents frown upon, just as verses once spread in the Caliphates by wrapping scandal in rhyme. The details change, but the rhythm is the same. Art refuses to stay within lines, and audiences secretly love it for that. Standing in the courtyard as the poet bows, you feel the ripple of laughter, the tension broken, the taboo transformed into entertainment. In that moment, poetry isn't just words. It is defiance, dressed in rhyme, immortalized in ink, and carried into history on the breath of every listener. The laughter from the poet's verses fades, and the mood shifts again. The merriment of rhyme gives way to a more chilling undertone, the punishments reserved for scandal. For all the indulgence behind curtains, when whispers escaped into the streets, the empire could respond with brutal swiftness. This was the other side of the contradiction. What entertained rulers in private could condemn commoners in public. The range of punishments varied. At times, it was exile, sending offenders far from the glitter of the capital into quiet villages where their names dissolved into silence. Other times, it was public flogging, staged in busy markets to send a message. And in extreme cases, particularly under stricter interpretations, stoning or execution was decreed. Imagine the terror of knowing that what was applauded in a palace poem could, for you, mean death in a public square. Chroniclers tell stories of lovers caught in secret meetings, dragged before judges, and forced to face penalties. Some escaped through bribes, wealth buying them the silence of officials. Others were less fortunate, their names erased from chronicles except as cautionary examples. The randomness is striking. It depended less on what you did than on who you were. Nobles could shield themselves, while ordinary citizens bore the full weight of the law. Doesn't it sound familiar to see justice bending beneath the pressure of status and coin? One famous example comes from Cordoba in the 10th century. A singer, accused of inappropriate liaisons, narrowly escaped severe punishment thanks to his popularity with the caliph's court. His music had charmed too many powerful ears for his enemies to bring him down. Instead of disgrace, he returned to singing, his fame brighter than before. Reputation, it seems, was often a stronger shield than law itself, but not all tales ended in survival. In Baghdad, a pair of lovers, one the daughter of a merchant, the other a young page, were discovered exchanging letters. Their families begged for leniency, but the local judge insisted on punishment to set an example. The page was banished, the girl forced into a marriage chosen by her relatives. Neither name appears again in history, swallowed by silence. Their story lingers only in the margins of chronicles, a reminder of how unforgiving rules could be when exposed to daylight. The fear of scandal shaped behavior. People learned to live double lives, one in the open, measured and cautious, the other hidden, whispered through poetry, music, or coded gestures. The market stalls you walked through earlier weren't just places of trade. They were also sites of surveillance. Neighbors watched neighbors, ready to gossip, ready to report. Privacy became a currency as precious as jewels. Do you feel the chill of that world, where a single glance could spark ruin? Even rulers were not immune. Some caliphs, accused of indulgences by their rivals, faced rebellions where whispers of scandal became weapons sharper than swords. Political enemies spread rumors of moral corruption, not necessarily because they cared about virtue, but because they knew scandal could erode legitimacy. Power and reputation were braided together, and a whisper could unravel them both. Punishments also carried symbolic weight. Public lashings weren't just about pain, they were theater. Crowds gathered, murmurs spread, and the lesson was etched into memory. Stray from the script, and you risk the stage of humiliation. The empire reinforced morality through spectacle, just as it reinforced devotion through processions and sermons. People lived inside a constant drama, sometimes applauding, sometimes fearing they would become the next actors. And yet, cracks in the system persisted. Bribes, favors, and alliances softened many sentences. A wealthy man could escape with a fine, where a poor man faced lashes. Justice, like entertainment, was unevenly distributed. The pattern is uncomfortably familiar across centuries. The higher your status, the more elastic the rules became. Walking away from these stories, you feel the tension of a society that lived in constant contradiction. Behind silk curtains, rulers enjoyed entertainments that blurred every boundary. But in public squares, punishment fell like a hammer to keep the illusion of order intact. History, it seems, is always balancing between indulgence and control, laughter and fear, applause and silence. The echo of punishment still hangs in the air as you step into a quieter chamber, filled not with judges or poets, but with physicians. Shelves are stacked with jars of powders, dried herbs, and mysterious concoctions. Here, the obsession is neither law nor poetry. It is stamina. Court physicians of the Caliphates, tasked with keeping rulers vigorous, often recommended remedies that today sound more like folklore than science. They reached for musk, ambergris, and cinnamon, blending them into pills believed to stir desire. Perfume tonics were poured into goblets, their scent alone thought to awaken the senses. Roasted lizard, yes, you heard that right, was ground into powders and prescribed as an enhancer of strength. In Baghdad's bustling apothecaries, men could purchase mixtures promising to restore vigor, just as modern shelves are filled with energy drinks and supplements. Different packaging, same human hope. The hunger for such remedies was fueled by pressure. Rulers, surrounded by harems and rivals, felt the need to demonstrate vitality not only as private indulgence, but as proof of their power. A vigorous ruler symbolized a strong empire. Physicians understood this and marketed their recipes accordingly, cloaking superstition in the language of medicine. Doesn't it sound familiar when you hear modern advertisements draped in science, yet promising miracles? Some ingredients were exotic, arriving on caravans from far-off lands. Ginseng from China, saffron from Persia, and rare resins from Africa found their way into potions. The farther the origin, the more powerful it was believed to be. Foreignness itself became part of the cure, as if distance lent potency. A jar of powder that traveled across deserts carried not only spice, but also prestige. Imagine the bragging rights of sipping a tonic mixed with ingredients fetched from the edge of the known world. The search for stamina also inspired bizarre regimens. Some physicians advised men to eat pigeon hearts or drink mixtures of honey and pepper. Others claimed certain exercises could prolong performance. Manuals survived, filled with advice that mixes earnest observation with wild imagination. One text suggests rubbing oils infused with cloves along the body to ignite warmth, a treatment. Not all remedies were harmless. Some mixtures contained toxic minerals or overdoses of spices that could cause more harm than benefit. There are accounts of men falling ill after consuming excessive amounts of so-called aphrodisiacs. But such risks rarely dampened demand. The promise of vitality was too tempting, the pressure to perform too heavy. How many times in history have people ignored danger for the sake of pride? It wasn't just men who sought these treatments. Women in harems also turned to remedies promising beauty, fertility, or allure. Recipes for enhancing complexion included ground pearls mixed with rose water, while concoctions for increasing desire ranged from spiced syrups to strange amulets worn under clothing. The boundary between medicine, magic, and cosmetics blurred until they became one continuous marketplace of hope. Physicians themselves walked a tightrope. They were respected for their learning, yet many knew their remedies were based as much on tradition as on science. Still, they operated in a system where failure wasn't an option. If a ruler doubted their effectiveness, the physician could face dismissal or worse. So they perfected the art of confidence, writing detailed instructions, quoting authorities like Galen or Hippocrates, and assuring patients that success was near. The performance was as important as the prescription. The pursuit of stamina also fed into poetry and jokes. Abu Nuwas once mocked a friend for relying too heavily on potions, suggesting that no medicine could cure a lack of natural charm. Satire became a way to puncture the endless obsession with remedies, though it never slowed the trade. Demand, after all, was insatiable. As you scan the shelves of jars and powders, you realize these medical oddities reveal more than curiosity. They show the weight of expectation placed on rulers and courtiers alike. Strength was political currency, and failure could invite whispers of weakness. So men and women alike swallowed powders, rubbed oils, and trusted in recipes that promised what nature might not provide. The chamber grows dim as you leave, jars glinting faintly in the lamplight. The search for vitality has not ended, it merely shifted forms. The tonics of medieval Baghdad echo in the pills and potions of today. History reminds you that desire, fear, and pride are the oldest customers in every market. The smell of herbs and powders fades as you walk out into cooler night air. The courtyards are quieter now, shadows long against the marble walls, and you sense the story is drawing to a close. But endings in history are rarely clean. Here's your hook. What glittered in silk and perfume, what thrived in poetry and markets, eventually dimmed, not because people stopped desiring, but because empires themselves began to falter. By the later centuries of the Caliphates, harems shrank. The once grand rituals of selection became rarer, their extravagance harder to maintain as treasuries emptied and political crises multiplied. Dynasties spent more time defending borders than arranging banquets, and reformers rose with stern voices, determined to bury the excesses of earlier courts. What had been tolerated in whispers was rewritten in chronicles as shameful indulgence. Memory itself was censored. Religious scholars gained more influence in shaping public morality, pushing for stricter enforcement of laws and less tolerance for the blurred lines of earlier ages. Eunuchs lost their prominence as centralized power weakened, and harems, once symbols of prestige, became relics. In Ottoman times, the harem survived but under different structures, more tightly controlled, less flamboyant than in Abbasid Baghdad or Umayyad Cordoba. The tone shifted from playful poetry to guarded decorum. You can still see traces, though, if you look closely. Verses of Abu Nuwas survived, because readers copied them in secret, passing them like contraband literature. Market records preserved the lists of exotic slaves, even as later historians tried to gloss over the details. Physicians' manuals still contain recipes for bizarre remedies, sandwiched between serious medical notes. The past leaves fingerprints even when someone tries to scrub the glass clean. The decline of indulgence was tied not only to morality, but to power. Empires weakened, and the spectacle of excess became a weapon for critics. Enemies described rulers as corrupt, obsessed with harems, distracted by dancers, while provinces rebelled. To survive politically, later rulers needed to present themselves as disciplined, almost austere. Pleasure was not erased, but it retreated deeper into privacy, away from the gaze of chroniclers. And yet, the fascination never disappeared. European travelers in later centuries, peering through distorted accounts, painted harems as dens of fantasy, projecting their own imaginations onto a world already fading. Ironically, as Muslim reformers tried to suppress memories of these practices, outsiders exaggerated them, turning whispers into legends. That is why, even now, when people hear the word harem, it conjures images half true, half myth. Isn't it curious how forgetting and exaggerating can both distort reality? The individuals once central to these practices often vanished from the record. The painted courtiers with coal-lined eyes, the women chosen in candlelit rituals, the eunuchs who held keys, most names dissolved into anonymity. History remembers the rulers, sometimes the poets, rarely the performers themselves. But if you listen closely, their presence hums through the gaps, like music heard faintly from a closed room. Decline, though, does not mean erasure. The cultural current survived in subtler ways. Lyrics in folk songs, metaphors in everyday speech, culinary traces from slaves who once cooked in foreign palaces. Even when reformers scrubbed archives, daily life carried forward fragments of the past. You might call it history's habit of hiding memories in plain sight. So when you step back from the whole journey, painted boys, guarded harems, bustling slave markets, eunuchs wielding silent authority, rituals of selection, contracts of convenience, poets singing rebellion, punishments of scandal, physicians' odd remedies, you see a tapestry woven from contradictions, indulgence and restraint, laughter and fear, survival and desire. The Caliphates were not simply pious or decadent. They were both at once, their grandeur sustained by paradox. The empire's decline dimmed the stage, but the echoes remain. Every culture has its hidden corners, its double lives. The Islamic Caliphates, for all their laws and sermons, were no exception. And as you drift from the marble corridors into the still night, you realize history's most shocking secrets are rarely the ones shouted. They are the ones whispered, lived, and then buried, waiting for someone like you to stumble across them centuries later. You step away from the perfume chambers and the whispered scandals, and suddenly the mood shifts. Behind the curtains of indulgence lay another truth, one not of silk or song, but of iron and fire. The same empire that celebrated poetry and staged elaborate rituals also ruled with a fist that could crush cities. For while its courts played with desire and indulgence, its armies pressed outward, seizing lands and bending entire peoples to its will. And here the tone darkens, because the cruelties inflicted on the conquered would leave scars far deeper than any secret carried in the harem. You don't need a sword at your throat to feel conquered. Sometimes, a tax collector's pen will do the job just fine. But under the early Islamic Caliphates, you didn't always get to negotiate. Imagine being told that the only way to move freely, to breathe without harassment, was to declare allegiance to a new faith, or else settle into a permanent role as a second-class subject. That's the atmosphere many newly conquered people walked into. Not a blaze of fire and smoke, but an invisible cage woven out of law, taxes, and social rules. Conversion wasn't always demanded at sword point, yet the choice wasn't exactly free either. Picture it like a rigged game show. Sure, you can keep your old religion, but the prizes are humiliation, heavy fees, and a constant reminder you don't quite belong. It worked like this. Once territories were folded into the caliphates, non-Muslims were sorted neatly into categories. Christians, Jews, and certain other groups were labeled people of the book and technically allowed to keep their beliefs. Sounds generous, right? But here comes the twist. They were also assigned the status of dhimmi. Protected people, yes, but protected in the way a strict landlord might protect you while also charging sky-high rent and setting rules you couldn't change. You could worship, but not too loudly. You could live, but not too proudly. And if you thought being dhimmi was a good deal, wait until you saw how your children grew up, watching their parents bow their heads to pay a humiliating tax. One of the most famous examples comes from the reign of Caliph Umar in the 7th century. He enforced what later became known as the Pact of Umar, a long list of conditions for Christians and Jews living under Muslim rule. No building new churches, no public displays of crosses, no ringing bells. Even riding horses was restricted. After all, a noble animal was apparently too honorable for those outside the dominant faith. Can you imagine being told you had to walk while your neighbor rode past just because of your religion? That wasn't law meant to keep peace. It was law meant to remind you of your place every single day. And here's the subtle cruelty. It didn't always come wrapped in overt violence. A blade wound can heal, but the slow drip of humiliation reshapes an entire society. Parents told their children not to speak too loudly in church. Merchants hesitated before painting symbols on their shop doors. Imagine running your bakery and realizing you can't even put a cross-shaped loaf in the window because someone might report you for violating the pact. This wasn't about belief anymore. It was about control, bending conquered peoples into forms that fit a rigid hierarchy. Now think of the psychological weight. Conversion dangled as a tempting shortcut. Want to escape the jizya tax? Convert. Want to avoid being treated as a second-class citizen? Convert. Want your son to be free from humiliation? Convert. For some, faith gave them the strength to resist, but for many, exhaustion wore them down. History records waves of conversions, not just out of spiritual conviction, but out of sheer survival instinct. And doesn't that raise a question worth pausing on? What does it do to your soul when your faith is tied to whether or not you can pay rent or ride a horse? Of course, rulers defended these rules by framing them as fair. Muslims paid zakat, charity tax, while non-Muslims paid jizya. But the difference was glaring. Zakat was part of a religious duty tied to community welfare. Jizya was a brand, a visible mark of submission, often collected with rituals designed to humiliate the payer. Chroniclers describe scenes where conquered subjects had to bow their heads while handing over the tax, guards standing by to remind them who held the power. Compare that to paying your taxes today. Annoying, yes, but no one makes you kneel in front of an IRS officer while doing it. The harsh irony is that this wasn't uniform across all caliphates or all times. Some rulers were stricter, some more relaxed, and in certain regions, dhimmis could thrive as merchants, doctors, or scholars. But the underlying rule never went away. Your life as a non-Muslim was conditional. Conditional on your wallet, your silence, and your willingness to remember who was in charge. Think of someone like the Nestorian Christians in Baghdad. They contributed to science, medicine, and philosophy under the Abbasid caliphs, yet they lived under laws that constantly reminded them they weren't equals. It's a bit like being the star employee in a company that still refuses to put your name on the door. And here's a twist of human nature. Power always loves to dress itself up as mercy. Caliphs often claimed they were showing tolerance by letting conquered people live with their religions intact. But when tolerance comes with chains, is it really tolerance? Or is it just another way of keeping the conquered close enough to use, but weak enough never to threaten? It's a question that echoes through history, and perhaps one you can ask yourself. How free would you feel if every freedom you had came stamped with the condition, as long as you obey? You can almost hear the coins clinking before the soldiers even leave town. Once a city had surrendered, the caliphate didn't waste time with subtle gestures of rule. Instead, they rolled out what became one of the empire's sharpest tools, the tax system. The jizya for non-Muslims, the kharaj for landowners, both designed not just to fund the empire, but to remind conquered people exactly where they stood. Think of it as a constant bill for breathing. If you were Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, or anything else, you weren't just paying your way. You were financing the very system that kept you beneath it. Taxes have never been popular, of course. Everyone grumbles about them. But the genius and cruelty of these levies was how personal they felt. Jizya wasn't tucked quietly into a ledger. It was often collected in public. Some accounts describe non-Muslims lining up, handing over their coins, while officials sneered or recited humiliating words. Imagine if your modern income tax was due in the town square, with neighbors watching and the collector reminding you, you pay this because you're lesser. Suddenly, that April 15th deadline doesn't look so bad. The kharaj was even heavier, targeting the land conquered subjects owned. Farmers who once tilled their own fields now harvested not for their families, but to feed an empire that rarely looked back at them with kindness. There's a story from Egypt after the Muslim conquest. Coptic farmers saw their harvest shrink under the weight of kharaj, their villages collapsing when too many fled to avoid the debt. A field of golden wheat might look like prosperity, but to the farmer, it was just a shimmering reminder of what would be taken. And here's where the cruelty sharpened. These taxes weren't stable. They could be raised without warning, depending on the whims of local governors or the hunger of armies on campaign. You might scrape together enough coins one year, only to find the rate doubled the next. Some governors, desperate for revenue, forced villagers to sell children into servitude to pay off arrears. That's not just a tax system, it's economic warfare. And can't you picture the conversations in those dusty marketplaces? Do you sell the goat or the son? It's the kind of choice no one should have to make, but history shows plenty did. Now, to be fair, not every ruler enforced the system with iron fists. Under more pragmatic caliphs, taxes were calibrated to keep conquered populations productive. After all, a starving peasantry produces nothing. But the principle remained. Non-Muslims carried an extra financial burden, their pockets permanently lighter than their Muslim neighbors. Over time, this disparity created a quiet pressure to convert. Who wouldn't look at their tax bill and think, maybe it's time to join the winning side? Even the staunchest believer might glance at the ledger and feel their faith wobble. The Abbasids in Baghdad, famed for their culture and science, relied heavily on these taxes to fund their splendor. Those magnificent palaces and libraries weren't conjured out of thin air. Behind the golden mosaics lay the sweat of farmers, artisans, and dhimmis handing over coin after coin. Isn't it ironic that the same Christians and Jews, forced to pay extra taxes, also staffed the empire's hospitals and translated its scientific texts? You built the brilliance, but you paid extra just to exist. Modern parallels aren't hard to see. Imagine if you had to pay double rent because of your religion, or if your electricity bill came with a line that said, "Penalty for not belonging." That's the kind of daily reminder conquered subjects endured. It wasn't simply about economics. It was about identity. Every time the collector came knocking, the unspoken message was clear. You're tolerated, but you're not equal. Of course, the empire justified all of this with scripture and law. The Quran was interpreted to allow jizya, painting it as a fair alternative to forced conversion. But on the ground, fairness rarely matched theory. Villagers in Armenia or Persia didn't feel the abstract comfort of theology when they saw their pantries emptied by tax demands. To them, it wasn't divine balance. It was survival, shrinking day by day. So while today we grumble about parking tickets or VT receipts, you might pause to appreciate the relative mercy of modern taxation. At least your government doesn't force you to hand over your money in front of a jeering crowd. Or, to put it another way, at least no one knocks on your door to remind you that your very existence carries a surcharge. If taxes drained your purse, the slave markets drained your dignity. Few empires ran their war spoils with such efficiency as the Caliphates, and nothing showcased this more than the sprawling trade in human beings. Imagine stepping into a city like Damascus or Baghdad and seeing stalls, not just selling silk or spices, but people, captured in campaigns from Spain to Central Asia, lined up under the hot sun, their worth haggled over like livestock. Conquest was profitable, and captives were the currency of the day. Wars didn't just redraw maps, they stocked markets. When Muslim armies swept into the Byzantine or Persian frontiers, the defeated weren't always killed. Survivors were marched off in chains, their lives instantly transformed into property. Women were priced for beauty and fertility, men for strength and labor, children for adaptability. You'd hear auctioneers praising the qualities of a boy as if he were a prized horse, or extolling the domestic skills of a young girl. Can you imagine overhearing your future, described not in terms of your dreams or talents, but how much coin you'd fetch in a transaction? The cruelty wasn't just the sale itself, it was the web that followed. Slaves were moved along massive networks that tied together the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Some were marched for months through deserts. Others were shipped across seas where disease and exhaustion thinned their numbers. Historians estimate that tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of captives changed hands over the centuries, their journeys erasing the borders of their homelands and pulling them into lives they never chose. And the Caliphates weren't shy about showcasing their power through this trade. In Baghdad, Elite buyers would compete for the rarest captives, driving up prices like collectors chasing limited edition treasures. The irony. Many of these same rulers would later commission grand poems about justice and compassion, all while their palaces buzzed with the footsteps of those who'd been stripped of freedom. It's the sort of contradiction history is littered with. Golden words set against grim realities. Occasionally, some captives rose to prominence. The Mamluks, for example, began as slave soldiers but eventually seized power in Egypt, ruling as sultans themselves. On the surface, that might sound like a rags-to-riches success story. But don't let the exception fool you. The path to such power was paved by a system that dehumanized countless others. For every Mamluk who grabbed a throne, thousands remained anonymous, working fields, serving tables, or fading into forgotten corners of palaces. Would you gamble your life on odds that small? The markets also had ripple effects. Communities left behind in conquered regions bore scars that lasted generations. Families torn apart rarely saw each other again. Imagine a father in Anatolia watching his son marched away in chains, knowing the boy might end up in North Africa or beyond. It wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the knowledge that the boy's identity, language, and very sense of self would be swallowed whole. When you zoom out, you see entire villages hollowed out, their strength shipped off to build the wealth of foreign cities. What makes it sting even more is how normalized it became. Merchants treated captives like part of the economy, slotting them alongside textiles and metals in trade records. To the people running the numbers, a captive wasn't a tragedy, just a line item. It's not so different from how corporations today sometimes talk about human resources, reducing flesh and blood people to statistics. But at least in your HR meeting, you aren't standing on an auction block. The Caliphates weren't alone in this practice, of course. Slavery was a global phenomenon, from Rome to the Americas. But the scale and integration of it into the empire's economy made it especially devastating for the conquered. Captives didn't just fuel labor. They became the very gears of expansion. Farms were staffed, armies reinforced, harems stocked, all on the backs of people who once had homes, voices, and names. So when you stroll through those imagined markets, don't just see the spectacle of buying and selling. Hear the silence of lives interrupted, futures rewritten by the clang of a buyer's coin. It wasn't the battlefield's sword that scarred deepest. It was the quiet cruelty of turning human beings into merchandise. Some boys never grew into men because the Caliphates made sure their childhood ended under the knife. If taxes bled your purse and slave markets broke your family, then the practice of forced castration carved into the very core of identity. Eunuchs, boys taken as captives and mutilated, became one of the empire's most chilling inventions. And the irony? These mutilated children, stripped of their manhood, often rose to wield immense influence inside the very palaces that destroyed them. Imagine the scene. A caravan of young boys captured from conquered regions, dragged to a remote outpost where surgeons waited. The procedure itself was horrific. Without the medicine or sanitation you know today, survival rates were dismal. Some estimates say more than half of the boys died in the process. The survivors, though, became eunuchs, and their altered bodies made them perfect tools for empire. They were considered safe around women in harems, loyal because they could never start their own dynasties, and controllable because the empire literally defined their existence. Can you think of a crueler way to say, "We own you"? then reshaping someone's body forever? The Abbasid Caliphate, in particular, built an entire bureaucratic machine staffed with eunuchs. These men, if we can even call them fully that after what was done to them, became gatekeepers of power. They guarded harems, managed treasuries, and sometimes even influenced the succession of caliphs themselves. Picture the whispers in palace halls, a ruler's mother confiding in her trusted eunuch, or a court official bending policies because a eunuch advisor nudged the balance. The irony hits hard. Empire used mutilation not just for humiliation, but as a foundation for governance. And here's the paradox that makes history so darkly fascinating. While most eunuchs lived in sorrowful obscurity, a few rose to astonishing prominence. One example is the eunuch chamberlains under Caliph al-Muqtadir in the 10th century. They were said to have had the caliph's ear more than generals or viziers. Think about that. A boy ripped from his home, mutilated, and remade into a palace tool, later steering the empire's course. But instead of being proof of opportunity, it was proof of how deeply cruelty was baked into the system. You didn't climb the ladder, you were welded into it. Now pause and ask yourself, what would it do to your psyche to be reminded daily that the very thing stolen from you is what gives you status? Eunuchs stood as living symbols of conquest. For the people in conquered lands, seeing their sons turned into palace guards was like watching the empire carve its brand into their family bloodline. Imagine a father hearing years later that his boy now strutted through Baghdad in silk robes, powerful but unrecognizable, the price of that success being the mutilation he'd never chosen. It wasn't just about the boys themselves. The practice also destabilized families and communities. Villages lived in fear of raids not just for slaves, but for sons who might be mutilated. In some accounts from Africa, families resorted to hiding their boys in forests when raiders approached, praying the soldiers would leave without finding them. This wasn't just an attack on bodies. It was an attack on continuity, the ability of a people to reproduce their future. The empire justified it, of course. Claiming eunuchs ensured the purity of harems or the loyalty of palace staff. But when you peel back that thin veil of logic, all you see is cruelty repackaged as order. It's a bit like a boss today insisting long unpaid overtime builds character. Except here, the cost wasn't sleep or free time. It was manhood, family, and future. And unlike a bad boss, you couldn't quit. Do you notice the thread weaving through all these cruelties? They weren't random acts of malice. They were calculated systems. Taxation made you pay for your subjugation. Slave markets made you merchandise, and castration turned you into a tool. Step by step, every part of life, wallet, body, and family, was pulled into the machinery of empire. That's what made it so effective and so terrifying. You think losing your harvest to unfair taxes is cruel. Try losing your children to the empire's hunger for control. In many parts of the Caliphates, families lived with the nightmare of child levies. Boys taken from their homes, marched away, and reshaped into the soldiers and servants of a system that had conquered their parents. Some were trained for war, some pushed into servitude, and some never saw their families again. Imagine hearing hooves in the night and knowing the knock at the door wasn't a neighbor. It was the empire coming for your son. This wasn't a random cruelty. It was a system, inspired by earlier practices that echoed through Byzantine and Persian traditions. The Caliphates perfected the art of breaking resistance by targeting the young. The Ottoman system would later give this practice its most infamous form, the devshirme, where Christian boys were taken from the Balkans and molded into the Janissaries. But the seed was planted long before, when caliphs and governors realized that the quickest way to control a people was to shape their children. After all, why waste years fighting stubborn fathers when you can train their sons to fight for you? Think of the psychological blow. A family's legacy is its children, the carriers of its name, culture, and faith. To see those children stripped away, baptized into the empire's military order, was to watch your future walk away under a banner not your own. Parents wept, but resistance was often futile. Soldiers had lists, quotas, and orders, and the empire's appetite didn't soften just because a mother clung to her child's arm. The cruelty wasn't only in the taking, it was in the permanence. Many of those boys never returned, or, if they did, they came back as strangers, speaking new languages, practicing new faiths, loyal to rulers who had stolen them. There are chilling stories of villages hiding their children in forests, churches, or even dressing them as girls to avoid detection. Imagine the constant anxiety, sending your child to fetch water and fearing he wouldn't return. And what a twisted irony. The very boys dragged away often became elite soldiers, feared across the empire. The Janissaries, for example, grew into one of the most formidable fighting forces in history. To their commanders, they were disciplined weapons. To their birth families, they were proof of a wound that never healed. Doesn't it sting to think the sword at your throat tomorrow might be held by the boy taken from your neighbor yesterday? And here's another layer of cruelty. These boys were sometimes given opportunities that peasants back home could never dream of. Education, wealth, military honor. They were paraded as proof that the empire uplifted its captives. But scratch the surface, and it's clear those opportunities were poisoned gifts. The price was identity. To gain rank, the boys had to sever ties with family, culture, and faith. It's like being handed a golden crown that can only be worn if you erase your own name. Would you take it? The practice also created deep divisions within conquered societies. Some families secretly hoped their sons might rise high in imperial ranks, while others saw the levy as nothing but theft. Over time, envy and bitterness sprouted among neighbors. Divide and conquer wasn't just a strategy. It was a side effect of policies that set parents against each other. Some mourning, some rationalizing, all of them changed. And yet, rulers praised this system as brilliant governance. Caliphs boasted of their loyal soldiers, men with no ties to local elites, no chance of rebelling to restore their homeland. They were weapons carved from childhood, wielded not just on battlefields, but as reminders of empire's reach. Every uniformed boy was both soldier and symbol, proof that the conquerors could turn your future into theirs. So, as you imagine walking through those villages, remember this wasn't just about lost children. It was about a stolen tomorrow. A people stripped of its youth is a people stripped of its hope, forced to watch their own legacy serve the very empire that ground them down. Picture yourself standing in a crowded square, the air heavy with dust and the smell of sweat, while everyone waits for the spectacle to begin. The Caliphates didn't just conquer lands. They conquered bodies, and they made sure the conquered understood that through punishments designed for theater. Amputations, floggings, public lashings. These weren't hidden away in dungeons. They were staged out in the open, turning pain into a civic lesson. You didn't just hear about the consequences of defiance. You saw them carved into the flesh of your neighbors. The logic behind it was clear. Fear is stronger when shared. If a thief lost a hand, it wasn't simply about justice. It was a billboard announcing empire's authority. The Quran itself was interpreted to permit corporal punishment, and rulers leaned heavily on that authority to enforce order. But in practice, punishments were often extended, exaggerated, or used to intimidate. Would you behave differently if you'd watched someone's back split open from 50 lashes under the sun? The empire bet on it. Travelers left chilling accounts. The 10th century geographer Al-Muqaddasi described punishments in Palestine so brutal that even hardened soldiers winced. Public amputations were done with crowds gathered, sometimes accompanied by recitations of scripture, as if to sanctify the cruelty. The condemned would be displayed afterward, a walking or limping reminder that order came at a cost. Imagine tripping on the street, your eyes meeting a man missing a hand, and knowing it wasn't an accident but a sentence. That's not just a scar, it's propaganda etched in human form. And it wasn't only thieves or rebels. Lesser infractions could earn whippings severe enough to leave lifelong damage. Markets became stages for these punishments, as merchants and shoppers were forced to pause their day to watch. The empire didn't want whispers. It wanted gasps. Compare that to modern life. If someone skips paying their taxes, maybe they get a fine in the mail. Back then, you got dragged to the square and turned into the afternoon's grim entertainment. Some rulers were harsher than others. Caliph al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, notorious for his iron fist in the 7th century, ordered mass executions and cruel punishments to stamp out dissent in Iraq. His reputation was so severe that even centuries later, his name was shorthand for brutality. Imagine living under a man whose mere signature on an order could end not just your life, but your family's livelihood. That kind of fear seeps into the bones of a community. What makes these punishments stand out isn't only the physical pain, it's the humiliation. Victims were paraded, their suffering turned into lessons. To lose a hand wasn't just to lose utility, it was to carry an eternal badge of shame, a daily reminder to yourself and everyone else that you'd been broken by the state. It turned crime into a permanent brand, one you could never wash away. Now ask yourself, did these punishments create obedience or just resentment bottled deep? On the surface, order was maintained. People thought twice before rebelling or stealing. But beneath, bitterness simmered. Communities remembered the cruelty, told stories of the punishments, passed them down like folklore. Fear might keep people quiet in the moment, but in the long run, it builds a legacy of hate that outlasts even the rulers. So as you leave that imagined square, the crowd dispersing and the condemned carried away, you realize the real target wasn't just the man punished. It was everyone watching. The empire didn't only break bones, it bent spirits, teaching conquered peoples that their bodies could be turned into billboards at any time. A single locked door could hide a world of cruelty, and in the Caliphates, that door often led straight into the harem. Behind silken curtains and marble walls, conquered women were stripped not just of freedom, but of identity. Turned into living trophies for rulers who measured their power partly by how many captives filled their palaces. The harem wasn't only about pleasure, it was about control. about bending human beings into ornaments of empire. Conquest always left a trail of captives, and many of those women ended up in harems. Persians, Greeks, Armenians, Circassians, Slavs. Imagine being marched hundreds of miles from your village, only to find yourself in a hall lined with strangers, judged by attendants who whispered about your skin, your hair, your eyes. You weren't a person anymore. You were a commodity dressed in brocade. The cruel genius of the harem system was that it mixed luxury with captivity. On the surface, women lived surrounded by perfumes, jewels, and silks. But look closer. They were prisoners gilded in gold. Their movements were restricted, their choices erased. Every smile had to please, every gesture measured, because their survival depended on the shifting moods of one powerful man or the rivalries of his court. Can you picture the tension of a room where a glance could mean promotion or punishment? History remembers certain women who rose above this cage, but their stories are rare exceptions. Take Shajar al-Dur, a former slave who became Sultana of Egypt in the 13th century. Her path to power is legendary, but it hides a darker truth. For every Shajar al-Dur, thousands of others vanished nameless into palaces, their lives reduced to whispers. That imbalance is the true measure of cruelty. And the rivalries inside harems were sharpened deliberately. Women were pitted against each other for influence, their worth rising and falling like stocks. For the rulers, this kept order. Better to have captives claw at each other than unite against their master. For the women, it meant constant anxiety. Imagine lying awake at night, not from hunger or poverty, but from fear that tomorrow a rival might ruin you with a single rumor. Even children born in harems carried the shadow of this system. Sons of concubines sometimes rose to inherit thrones, but their mother's status marked them with suspicion. A future sultan could trace his lineage to a girl once dragged from a conquered town, reshaped into palace property. The irony? Empires that prided themselves on noble bloodlines often ran on the veins of the very people they subjugated. And here's where the cruelty grows sharper. Some harems became symbols of empire's wealth, proudly displayed to foreign visitors. What outsiders saw as splendor was, in reality, a hall of captives. It's like bragging about your art collection when every painting was stolen. Behind the glittering surface was the echo of weeping mothers, empty homes, and daughters who never returned. So when you imagine those candlelit chambers, don't be fooled by the silk and song. The harem wasn't a paradise of luxury. It was a prison with golden bars, where human beings were remodeled into instruments of power. And every smile in those portraits hides the truth that someone else's daughter, someone else's sister, was forced to play a role in an empire's theater of control. You might think conquest only happens with armies and swords, but sometimes it works more quietly, by peeling away a people's voice, song, and story until they forget who they were. That's the cruelty of cultural erasure under the Caliphates. Beyond the taxes, the punishments, and the harems, another battle was waged, one against memory. When lands like Persia, Egypt, or North Africa were folded into the expanding empire, the conquerors didn't always demand that the people drop their religions overnight, but they steadily pressed them to drop their languages, traditions, and visible identities. And isn't losing your culture a kind of slow death? Picture yourself in a marketplace in Syria in the 8th century. You speak Greek, the language of your family for generations, but the courts and tax offices now only recognize Arabic. You can still barter for bread, yes, but if you want to protect your land deeds or petition a governor, you must use the conqueror's tongue. Suddenly, your language feels like a liability, a badge of weakness you're better off hiding. Over time, the generations after you might stop speaking it altogether, not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded it. Take Egypt as an example. Before the Muslim conquest, Coptic was the everyday language of the people. Within a few centuries, Arabic replaced it almost entirely. By the 13th century, you'd struggle to find anyone outside the church who could still speak Coptic fluently. That wasn't just a natural shift. It was the result of systemic pressure. Laws, education, and administration all pushing one direction. Imagine waking up one day to realize that your grandmother's lullabies are now strange syllables your children can't understand. Isn't that heartbreak in its own way? And it wasn't just language. Traditions and art also bent under the weight of conquest. Local festivals were suppressed or quietly rebranded, symbols erased from public life. Churches and synagogues were sometimes restricted from repairs, forcing them into decay while new mosques rose. Even clothing became a cultural battlefield, with rules about what dhimmis could wear, often duller colors, so they'd stand out as lesser. Think about that. Walking down the street, you weren't simply yourself. You were a moving signboard announcing submission. Sometimes the empire even co-opted the conquered people's brilliance. Persian administrators, Greek scholars, Indian mathematicians, all absorbed into the empire's machinery. Their knowledge thrived, yes, but often under new labels, their original cultural roots smudged away. It's like someone taking your recipe, serving it at their feast, and then erasing your name from the menu. Everyone praises the flavor, but no one remembers the cook. The effect was long-lasting. Even today, you see regions where the old languages flicker only in liturgy or dusty manuscripts, the daily voices of those peoples long silenced. Isn't it remarkable, and a little tragic, how an empire can die, but its imposed culture still lingers, outliving both conqueror and conquered? Arabic became not just a language, but a stamp pressed into the identity of lands far beyond Arabia. Of course, rulers justified this as unity, a single language, a single administration, a shared cultural framework. That's how you keep an empire from splintering. But to the conquered, it often felt like being swallowed whole. You didn't just lose battles. You lost your words, your customs, your right to dress, worship, or celebrate freely. And that kind of loss doesn't draw blood, but it drains spirit, leaving behind empty spaces where heritage once lived. So, as you walk through those conquered cities in your imagination, don't just see the mosques rising or the taxes collected. Listen closely to the silences, the vanished songs, the forgotten prayers, the children who no longer know the stories of their ancestors. That silence is the sound of empire's cruelest trick. Not just conquering your body, but erasing your soul, one custom at a time. A single torch could erase centuries, and in the Caliphates that torch sometimes found its way into libraries. If losing your culture through silence was slow, then losing it through fire was sudden and final. Conquered peoples often watch their accumulated knowledge, scrolls, manuscripts, chronicles, disappear in flames or neglect as rulers chose what should survive. The cruelty here wasn't just physical destruction. It was the deliberate cutting of memory. the erasure of voices that might have challenged the empire's story. Take the example of Alexandria, whose great library had already suffered damage under Roman and Christian conflicts. By the time Arab armies entered Egypt in the 7th century, legends tell of further destruction, whether by flame or neglect. Some later writers claim the library's scrolls were used as fuel for baths, though historians debate the details. Still, what mattered to the people at the time was the perception. Knowledge that could have preserved their past seemed to vanish overnight. Imagine being a scholar, dedicating your life to texts, only to watch soldiers treat them as kindling. That wasn't just burning paper. It was burning identity. And it wasn't just libraries. Conquered scholars themselves faced suspicion. Zoroastrian priests in Persia found their manuscripts destroyed or confiscated. Christian monks saw their chronicles restricted, sometimes rewritten to favor the conqueror's narrative. Think of it this way. History is always written by the victors. But here, the losers' records weren't merely ignored. They were actively silenced. What better way to cement power than to erase the possibility of remembering a different version of events? Ironically, the Caliphates also became famous for their translation movement, especially in Baghdad's House of Wisdom. Works of Aristotle, Galen, and Indian mathematicians were translated into Arabic, studied, and expanded. But here lies the paradox. The empire preserved and celebrated foreign knowledge that served its growth, while discarding or suppressing knowledge tied to conquered people's independence or faith. It's like keeping the blueprints that help you build a palace while tossing the stories that remind people they once owned the land it sits on. Picture yourself as a villager in Persia. Your ancestors' Zoroastrian hymns are now treated as relics, barely tolerated, while Greek philosophy is copied and praised because it fits the empire's intellectual fashion. Wouldn't you feel the sting of double standards? Your songs fade, while foreign ideas flourish, not because they're better, but because the empire found them useful. That's cruelty disguised as progress. And remember, this wasn't just about scholars. Ordinary people felt the loss too. When chronicles, poems, and genealogies vanished, communities lost the threads that tied them together. Oral traditions can survive, but without written anchors, much slips away. Ask yourself, how much of your culture could you preserve if tomorrow every book, every record, every written memory were confiscated or burned? Even when knowledge wasn't destroyed outright, it was sometimes locked behind barriers. Certain texts could only be studied by Muslim scholars, leaving non-Muslims cut off from their own histories. Imagine being told that the story of your ancestors now exists only in a language you don't speak, guarded in a building you can't enter. That's not just loss. It's exile from your own past. The cruelty of knowledge control lies in its invisibility. You can see a tax collector, you can see a slave chain, but you can't see the centuries of wisdom that vanish when a library falls silent. Yet its absence shapes everything. Future generations grow up without maps to their history, believing the conqueror's version is the only truth. And in that way, the empire wins twice. First on the battlefield, then in the memory of the conquered. So when you think about cruelty, don't stop at the blade or the whip. Think of the fire licking at scrolls, the quiet of locked archives, the silence of erased songs. Those losses might not leave scars on the body, but they cut just as deep, scarring the very soul of a people. The empire didn't always need chains to control you. Sometimes it just handed you a spear and shoved you to the front lines. One of the cruelest realities of life under the Caliphates was the relentless pull of military conscription. Conquered peoples, especially non-Muslims, were often forced into armies that fought battles they had no stake in, shedding blood for rulers who had crushed their own homelands. Imagine being marched east to fight Persians after your father had already died resisting the same conquerors. That isn't honor. That's exploitation in uniform. Conscription wasn't just about manpower. It was about breaking resistance. Once your sons were in the Empire's army, they couldn't be in your village organizing rebellion. And for rulers, foreign soldiers made sense. Men with no loyalty to local elites could be pointed anywhere, like chess pieces with no say in the game. Some were used as cannon fodder in the harshest campaigns, pushed into impossible battles where survival was little more than a coin toss. Can you feel the cruelty in that calculation, knowing someone has decided your life is cheaper than theirs? The practice stretched across centuries. Under the Abbasids, prisoners of war were drafted en masse. Under later dynasties, whole populations were compelled to provide troops, their service written into treaties or demanded through quotas. The Ottomans perfected the system with the Janissaries, child soldiers torn from Christian families and forged into one of the most feared armies in the world. It's impressive on a military chart, but for the families left behind, it was heartbreak disguised as service. And here's the paradox that history loves to throw at you. Some of these conscripted soldiers did rise to prominence. A few climbed the ranks, gaining wealth, land, even command. But think of the price. You gain honor by forgetting your people, prestige by shedding their blood. That's not opportunity. It's a trap painted gold. Would you feel proud leading an army if the sword in your hand was the same kind that once cut down your kin? Accounts from chroniclers suggest conscripts were often treated with less care than regular Muslim troops. They were paid less, given harsher duties, and punished more severely for mistakes. To the empire, they weren't brothers in arms. They were expendable bodies in armor. Compare that to today's military service, where at least you fight under your own flag. For these men, the flag they bled under was the same one that had burned their villages. The cruelty extended beyond the battlefield. Many conscripts never returned home. Some died on distant frontiers. Others were resettled far from their homelands, deliberately scattered to weaken local identities. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about uprooting. The empire wanted you not only as a soldier, but as a transplant, torn from the soil of your people and planted in foreign fields. And think of the families left behind. Every draft drained villages of their young men, weakening economies, tearing apart households. Mothers whispered prayers, not knowing if their sons were alive or buried in some nameless ditch hundreds of miles away. Fathers who once dreamed of handing down farms or crafts now stared at empty workshops. The damage didn't end with the battle. It echoed in every silent home. The empire defended conscription as duty, but to the conquered, it was theft of lives, of futures, of the right to choose. And the cruelest irony, when the empire celebrated victories, parading soldiers through the streets, those triumphs were often built on the backs of men whose hearts belonged to the very nations the parades had trampled. So when you picture those gleaming armies, don't just see discipline and might. See the hollow eyes of men fighting for a banner they never chose. Their steps heavy with the weight of a loyalty forced upon them. That's not glory. It's cruelty dressed in armor. Starving a city is slower than storming its gates, but to the Caliphates, it was often more effective and far crueler. Sieges weren't just military strategies. They were deliberate campaigns of hunger, turning bread and water into weapons sharper than swords. When armies encircled a city, no grain got in, no people got out. You didn't need to burn houses if you could let stomachs do the crumbling. Imagine being inside such a city. Markets empty, bakeries shuttered, wells running low. At first, families ration what little they have, boiling weeds into soups, stretching crumbs across days. Then hunger gnaws deeper. Neighbors turn suspicious. Rumors swirl about who has hidden stores. Parents skip meals so children can eat, but eventually even that sacrifice runs dry. And the enemy outside waits patiently, knowing time is their ally. Can you think of anything crueler than watching your children weaken, while soldiers beyond the walls polish their swords? Not with urgency, but with confidence. One infamous example comes from the siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718, when the Umayyads tried to break the Byzantine capital. For over a year, the city was blockaded, supplies cut off, while residents faced starvation. Though the Byzantines ultimately repelled the attack, chronicles describe horrifying shortages, with people resorting to desperate measures. Even when victory comes, the scars of such hunger never fade. Other cities weren't so fortunate. Smaller towns in Persia, North Africa, or Spain often surrendered after weeks of famine, their residents too weak to resist. In some cases, surrender terms still included heavy taxes or the loss of captives. Picture the bitterness. After starving for weeks, you open your gates not to relief, but to new burdens. It wasn't just conquest, it was conquest salted with cruelty. And starvation didn't just kill bodies, it killed dignity. To beg, to barter your last belongings for a crust of bread, to watch elders collapse from weakness, it shattered the spirit of a community. Soldiers knew this. Hunger was psychological warfare, forcing people to surrender not just walls, but hope. The empire could claim fewer casualties in such sieges, but the cost to civilians was immeasurable. Sometimes, the cruelty was heightened by deliberate destruction of crops and fields around besieged cities. Armies would burn orchards, poison wells, or trample farmland, ensuring that even if the siege lifted, famine lingered. Imagine seeing your granary torched, knowing the hunger wouldn't end with the battle, but would stretch into next year's harvest. It's a scar that survives longer than a sword wound. And yet, from the conqueror's perspective, it was efficient. Why waste soldiers storming walls when hunger does the work for free? But to the conquered, it was a lesson written in empty bellies. Resistance doesn't just bring swords, it brings slow death by starvation. Think of the cruel message it sent to surrounding towns. Submit quickly, or risk the same fate. Modern parallels help the weight sink in. Today, international law calls starvation of civilians a war crime. Back then, it was standard practice. You complain when the grocery store shelves run empty before a storm. Imagine months without bread, water rationed to drops, and the knowledge that your enemy designed it that way. So, when you picture the cruelty of the Caliphates, don't just think of gallows or chains. Think of the quiet agony of hunger, the sound of children crying in the night, the silence of kitchens with nothing left to cook. Sometimes the deadliest weapon wasn't steel. It was the absence of food. What invaders couldn't win with hunger, they often seized through sacrilege. The Caliphates weren't content with collecting taxes or soldiers. They reached into the spiritual heart of conquered peoples, plundering temples, churches, monasteries, and sacred relics. To strip a community of its holy sites was to wound it at the deepest level, not only robbing it of wealth, but tearing at its identity. After all, you can rebuild houses and markets, but what happens when your God's houses are looted? Walk into a church in Syria during the early conquests. Candles flicker, mosaics glimmer, prayers rise into incense. Then soldiers arrive, ordering silence. Crosses are pulled down, icons smashed, chalices melted into coin. Maybe the building is converted into a mosque, its bells silenced forever. For the faithful, it isn't just stone changing use, it's the sense that heaven itself has been robbed. Imagine showing up to pray one week, and the next, your altar is gone, replaced by words you don't understand and rules you never chose. This pattern repeated across regions. In Persia, Zoroastrian fire temples were extinguished, sacred flames that had burned for centuries snuffed out in an afternoon. In North Africa, Berber sanctuaries were dismantled. In Spain, churches became mosques overnight, sometimes retaining fragments of the old architecture, like ghosts of the faiths erased. The most famous is Cordoba's Great Mosque, built over a Visigothic church. Beautiful, yes, but to the conquered, beauty often felt like a mask stretched over humiliation. Relics, too, were fair game. Chalices, reliquaries, manuscripts, all taken as treasure. Gold and silver found new homes in palaces, while manuscripts were sold, hidden, or destroyed. What was sacred to one people became decoration for another. And the cruelty deepened when plunder was paraded, trophies shown off to remind everyone who held the power. Imagine the sting of seeing your community's relic glittering on a conqueror's table. For the conquerors, it was practical. Sacred spaces were prime real estate, located in city centers, often well-built and richly adorned. Why waste stone on new buildings when you can repurpose what already stands? But for the faithful, this was a knife twist. Their holiest places, once symbols of protection, now reminded them daily of their subjugation. Would you feel safe entering your old church if its walls now echoed prayers you didn't know? Sometimes there was a veneer of tolerance. Caliphs would allow certain churches or monasteries to remain, but only under strict conditions. Repairs required special permission. New construction was forbidden, and displays of faith were curtailed. Bells couldn't ring, processions were banned, symbols hidden. It wasn't outright destruction, but it was slow suffocation. Like a candle covered with glass, the flames still burned, but dimmer, starved of air. Think about the ripple effect on communities. A temple wasn't just a building. It was the center of festivals, rites of passage, collective memory. To lose it was to lose rhythm, to stumble through life without the markers that told you who you were. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, all altered under new rules, reshaping the identity of entire generations. And here's the bitter irony. While the conquerors silenced others' holy places, they lavished wealth on their own. Grand mosques rose with towering minarets, mosaics, and domes, built sometimes with the very stones torn from temples and churches. The message was clear. Your God bows to ours. Your relics serve our glory. Every skyline became a sermon. So when you picture conquest, don't only see armies marching and cities burning. See a mother clutching her child outside a desecrated church, a priest staring at an extinguished flame, A villager walking past a once sacred building, now claimed by another faith. That's conquest at its most intimate, stealing not just your land or food, but the very spaces where you once met the divine. Sometimes cruelty didn't wear armor or swing a sword. It whispered, schemed, and sowed suspicion. One of the sharpest tools the Caliphates used against conquered peoples was the classic strategy of divide and rule. Why exhaust yourself crushing united opposition when you can fracture it into quarrels, making rivals do the work for you? The empire understood that broken communities are easier to govern than strong, cohesive ones. Imagine a newly conquered province in Persia or North Africa. The local tribes and sects already carry grudges against one another, small rivalries simmering for years. The caliphate steps in and pours salt on those wounds. Officials grant privileges to one group while taxing another harder. They recruit certain tribes into auxiliary forces while excluding their rivals. Suddenly, old tensions ignite into fresh resentments. The empire doesn't need to lift a finger. Neighbors are too busy distrusting each other to unite against the conqueror. The Umayyads mastered this tactic. In Spain, Arab elites were given priority over local Berbers, even though Berbers had fought alongside them in the conquest. Berber soldiers, feeling exploited, eventually rebelled, only to be crushed, proving once again that division weakened resistance. In Iraq, rivalries between Arab tribes were stoked deliberately. Each promised favor in exchange for loyalty. The result was a chessboard where every piece looked sideways at its neighbor, instead of forward at the empire's hand pushing them. Religious differences were another pressure point. Christians were played against Jews, Nestorian Christians against Melkites, Sunni Muslims against Shia. Caliphs and governors positioned themselves as arbiters, stepping in to restore order after encouraging the very conflicts that needed restoring. It's like a schoolyard bully who whispers insults to both sides, then pretends to be the peacekeeper when fists fly. The conquered were left exhausted, divided, and easier to manage. And here's where the cruelty sharpened. Some communities willingly leaned into the empire's favoritism, hoping to secure better treatment. But those benefits often came at the cost of their neighbors. Imagine being a small sect offered tax breaks if you inform on your rivals. Do you take the offer and betray your neighbors, or refuse and risk harsher burdens? Either way, unity crumbles, and the empire wins. The genius and malice of divide and rule was its invisibility. Unlike public punishments or slave markets, it didn't always leave visible scars. But its effects were long-term, sowing mistrust that lingered even after the conquerors moved on. In some regions, old divisions hardened into permanent fractures, shaping politics for centuries. That's cruelty in slow motion, turning community bonds into fault lines that never heal. You can see the echoes even today. Borders carved by empires, rivalries exploited centuries ago. Many conflicts trace back to seeds planted in those years of manipulation. Think about it. What's more devastating than making conquered people believe their real enemy is the family across the river, instead of the empire collecting their taxes? So, as you picture conquest, don't only see the swords and sieges. See the quieter cruelty of whispers, favoritism, and manipulation. An empire pulling strings while neighbors turned against each other. Sometimes the sharpest weapon wasn't forged from steel, but from suspicion. What steel couldn't crush, the empire sometimes uprooted. Conquered peoples often found themselves victims of exile and deportation, driven from ancestral lands and scattered into foreign regions where survival meant starting over under the shadow of empire. It wasn't always about punishment for rebellion. It was strategy. Remove entire populations, transplant them far from their roots, and you weaken their ability to resist. After all, a tree without soil doesn't grow strong. Imagine being a villager in Armenia or Mesopotamia. One day, you're tending fields your family has farmed for generations. The next, you're herded into caravans, marched hundreds of miles to a land where the tongue is strange and the soil unfamiliar. The Caliphates used this tactic repeatedly. Rebels were deported en masse. Skilled artisans were uprooted to serve in imperial capitals. Entire communities were shifted like pawns on a board. It wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was engineering obedience by scattering strength. The Abbasids, for example, relocated thousands of Persians into Baghdad to build their glittering new city in the 8th century. Skilled craftsmen, scholars, and even farmers were brought in, not by invitation, but by order. The city dazzled the world, but behind its beauty were families torn from their homelands, forced to contribute brilliance far from where it belonged. Think of the irony. The empire's splendor, praised by poets, was fertilized with the sorrow of exile. Sometimes deportation came after rebellion. In North Africa, Berber tribes that resisted taxation were uprooted and resettled deeper inland, stripped of fertile land they had depended on. In Persia, entire villages were emptied after uprisings, their populations dispersed, so they could never regroup. Imagine watching your hometown vanish into silence, its houses abandoned, its fields left to weeds. That wasn't just conquest, it was erasure, achieved without a single sword blow. And here's the deeper cruelty. Exile didn't end with one generation. Children grew up hearing stories of lands they would never see, carrying a nostalgia that was both identity and burden. They belonged to two places at once: the soil under their feet and the soil stolen from their parents. Isn't that a wound that never quite closes? Even those not directly deported felt the weight. The threat of exile hung like a sword over communities. Disobey, and you won't just lose your harvest, you'll lose your home. It was a punishment that didn't need chains. The fear of being uprooted was enough to keep villages compliant. Their loyalty bought not with gold, but with the hope of staying in place. Modern parallels make it sting even more. Think of refugees today, carrying only what they can, forced to rebuild in lands that never asked for them. Now strip away even the sympathy of modern humanitarian aid, and you glimpse what exile under the Caliphates felt like. No welcome, no relief, just the command to move, or else. So when you trace the cruelty of empire, remember, it wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the quiet shuffle of feet on dusty roads. Families marching away from homes they would never see again. Sometimes the most devastating conquest wasn't death. It was displacement, a life unmoored, a people scattered to the winds. Even after the armies marched away, even after the sieges lifted and the palaces rose, the cruelest thing the Caliphates left behind wasn't always visible. It was the legacy of fear, the psychological scar etched into conquered peoples, a shadow that lingered long after the battles ended. Unlike hunger or taxes, this cruelty lived in minds, shaping how generations saw themselves and their place in the world. Think of the family who once hid their son from child levies, the mother who watched her daughter disappear into a harem, the farmer whose harvests were drained by endless taxes. Even when the empire softened or new rulers replaced the old, those memories remained. Children grew up hearing whispered warnings. Don't speak too loudly. Don't show too much pride. Don't resist. Fear became tradition, passed down like an heirloom nobody wanted but everyone carried. Communities learned to shrink themselves. Churches and synagogues that survived still kept bells silent, even when no soldiers stood outside. Villagers avoided old customs, fearing they might draw the wrong eyes. People adjusted their behavior, not because the conqueror stood in the square, but because the conqueror had taken root in their imagination. Isn't that the deepest cruelty? Not just controlling bodies, but colonizing minds. And fear had ripple effects. It fractured trust. Neighbors wondered who might inform to the governor. Parents debated whether to convert, not from conviction, but from exhaustion. Merchants weighed every business deal against the risk of attracting unwanted attention. Life became a constant calculation, survival a daily strategy. Even in peace, the conquered never felt free. Over time, this legacy shaped identities. Some communities clung fiercely to what was left of their traditions, defining themselves by resistance. Others blended into the empire, forgetting old languages and customs to escape humiliation. Both paths carried scars. To resist meant hardship. To assimilate meant erasure. Can you see how even centuries later, cultures in the Middle East and North Africa bear traces of this tension, the fingerprints of conquest pressed into the DNA of daily life? And here's the bitterest irony. Fear outlived the empire itself. The Umayyads fell, the Abbasids weakened, the Ottomans rose and declined. Borders shifted, rulers changed, yet the memories stayed. Folktales, proverbs, and community legends carried the echoes of cruelty. Don't anger the tacksman. Hide the boys when soldiers come. Phrases passed down long after the original danger was gone. It's like hearing thunder long after the storm is past, still flinching though the sky is clear. The Caliphates prided themselves on their achievements: science, architecture, administration, and those are real. But alongside the glitter runs a darker thread. The fear they planted, watered, and harvested from millions of conquered souls. And fear, once sown, doesn't die easily. It shapes generations, lingers in collective memory, and bends the posture of whole peoples. So, as you reach the end of this long march through cruelty, remember this: conquest doesn't always end when the last battle is fought. Its shadow lives on, in silence, in suspicion, in the ache of stories told at night. And sometimes the cruelest conquest is the one that never leaves, the one that teaches you to conquer yourself before anyone else can. And so, as the dust of empires settles and the echoes of conquest fade into the night, you're left with the truth that cruelty takes many forms. Sometimes it's the weight of a tax, sometimes the silence of a stolen culture, sometimes just the memory of fear that refuses to leave. The Caliphates carved their authority not only with swords, but with hunger, humiliation, and manipulation. Yet history teaches us that no shadow lasts forever. Peoples endured, voices resurfaced, and memory outlived oppression. Let that thought soothe you now. Empires rise, empires fall, but the human spirit bends without breaking. Close your eyes, drift into rest, and carry with you the quiet reminder that even in the darkest chapters, light always waits.